The Gruber Prize has always focused on justice through the law. As always, the recipients have been activists in the law in the sense of being lawyers or judges or people associated with civil rights movements. But we sometimes forget the extraordinary courage of the people who turn to the law and the huge risks which so many of them take in asking lawyers to take on their case and putting themselves in the foreground. And I think that came through clearly in the last discussion. Now, we have about 30 minutes. There's going to be room for discussion between the panelists themselves, but I think I'd like to begin by asking you in the audience to raise particular issues that you want. There will be a roving mic. Who has the mic? You do. Well, I see that there was a very quick hand there, so I better, in all honesty, recognize the first hand. Would you introduce yourself and explain your own background before you?
Sure. My name's Tamala Knapp. I work with Lunchbox Communications, who is handling the marketing, PR, and peer outreach for the Gruber Prize. My question is for Ms. Arnwine. You mentioned about citizens not being represented adequately by their elected officials and the fight for that. On our doorstep today, right outside, is the Occupy movement that's come into Philadelphia as of this morning and what they're fighting for. How do you see those grassroots types of demonstrations affecting change in Congress? What will it do? How can it do more? And what else can we do as citizens for that change?
I really appreciate your question, and thank you so much. It was very fascinating. 3 weeks ago, there was an article that Julian Bond put out. And the title of the article fascinated me because it said, "Where is the American left?" I mean, that was the question. And he talked about, interestingly, about the Tea Party movement and how it's gotten so much media attention, even though its numbers are really minuscule. And it was saying, how it was fascinating that the media had all this, fascination and love with the Tea Party movement, but there was no counterbalancing force. And of course, in the last, couple of weeks, the Occupy movement has, finally, after weeks of complaining about the lack of media attention, has finally started breaking into the mainstream media and has been spreading nationwide. I think that, we have to recognize that these extremes of, people who, that we deal with, people who either say, listen, the way you address, the problems in our country in this economic crisis is just to hate. My mom always teases me because I talk about hateration, but to, just to engage in all of this hate, and to, blame other citizens, or as, Rush Limbaugh has said, on TV, to, he said, in his radio program and in interviews that he thinks that, we should blame our neighbors because they were irresponsible with their finances, etc. I think that and on the other side, you have people saying, well, it's all Wall Street. And Wall Street, has, and the financial institutions have driven us into the ground. But I really think the issue for us is the imbalance of wealth. And the Atlantic did a great piece on this just last month, looking at just the incredible problem of the imbalance of wealth in this country. And if you got 1% of all the people holding all the wealth, and the other 99%, which is what the Occupy people talk about, losing wealth. And the articles that have appeared recently about how much wealth the middle class has lost, that you're going to have a lot of turmoil in society. So I do think it's important that a robust democracy is a democracy where people speak out, where people are engaged, where people are in the streets, advocating for positions. I think that's important, but I also think that we got to be careful in our democracy, that we don't fall for demagoguery, and that facts have, a real front and center role, that we understand what the real facts are and what's happening, and that we also marshal ourselves to really make the sacrifices to build, this society better. So I think that somewhere we have to come to a better medium, and where we have to come to a better vision of what we need to do. So I am so grateful for your question, because it can't be Tea Party. It can't be all about Tea Party. It can't all be about Occupy. It's got to be about the majority of the people of this country who really do not hate their neighbors, who really don't want to say let them die when it comes to health care, who would never boo somebody because they said they were gay. I mean, we have to make it about that voice and lifting that voice back up and giving it credibility and resonance. And I think that's what's missing, because the political arena's just playing. It's just, playing to whatever they think the mic is going to come to, and wherever they think the political attention is, and to extreme, to make each other the extreme, so that they can get political, cachet out of it, and that's not the way to lead. I really hate that our country has lost statesmanship. I hate it. I hate that our country is only about, politics, that is not about what is in the best interest of the people of this country, even if it means you don't get reelected. And when we get some courageous people standing up like that, who are willing to in this economy and in this time with all the money it takes to be a politician, but if we could just get some courageous people to stand, what a difference it would be for all of us.
Good morning. This is for Mr. Deese.
Sorry, could you identify yourself? Just tell us who you are.
My name is Alan Bronstein,
Oh,
and I am a friend and associate of the Grubers. And I just wanted to ask Mr. Deese, does you or your organization have any specific solution for the illegal immigration problem in the country?
Today, I would, if I was president, I'd do what President Reagan did. I would make a way of citizenship for the 6 to 8 million undocumented immigrants in this country. President Reagan did it, and there was no fallout whatsoever. Politics has changed. The solution that the business people in the United States are trying to push now, because they're worrying about the labor issues, whether it's construction or meat processing or you name it, is to expand the guest worker program. That could be a good program. European countries have done it well, including having health insurance for a guest worker arriving in England to do work, whatever it might be. We ran into that recently and saw that. But the program that's being pushed now is one that basically is close to slavery. They want to increase it to 500,000 guest workers from like 65,000 in the agricultural field. But they fix it so that if you're not happy with working for John's apple factory, picking his apples, you have to go back to where you came from, so you have no bargaining rights for your labor. And also they want to cut out the wage and make it more minimum wage than prevailing wage. So those are some serious issues. I think we need to clear a path for citizenship. We have written a proposal. We've testified before Congress, our people have on numerous occasions. And if you go online, you can see what we were proposing at the Southern Poverty Law Center's website. I can't articulate it any better than that for you at this point.
I would like to say something about it. We in Argentina had a migration law from the times of the dictatorship that was based in national security reasons. And this law lasted from 1980 to a couple of years ago, in which a group of associations among themselves drafted a new bill that considers migration as a basic human right and not as a national security question. I believe that this is the shift that is necessary to understand the situation of the migrant people. I know that this is difficult, especially here in the United States, notwithstanding it is a country, as Argentina is, made by migrants. But this must be in the present conscience of the people of today. That is in the best interest of the best values of this country to consider migrants as human beings with equal rights, everybody, and not as a problem, as a foreign that comes to rob something or to menace something, as is the issue in this moment.
If I may also, on this question, I agree with Morris, and I agree with the observation. I think we need to look north. Look at Canada. Canada has a model worth studying. The United States. I was in Toronto as part of the American Bar Association's annual meeting, and Toronto, 50% of everybody who lives in Toronto are new to Canada. Not just to Toronto, but have immigrated into Canada. And you can't find a more robust society and city than Toronto. It is gorgeous. The people, I was shocked. People of all races come up and just talk to you. And I was like, what? Because that's just not the way we operate in America. We pretend like we don't see each other. We don't talk to people. We're afraid of each other. And people were, just, coming up, and it's very fascinating. We need to, and that's because they have a more open border policy. That's because they don't have an anti-immigrant, although they have an anti-immigrant movement. Let me be very clear. I mean, I saw elements of that when I was there. But I just think that we need to look north, where they have so much better policies in general on celebrating a multiracial, multicultural society. And we need to really look at that model.
Just another addition. I found it striking that you used the word slavery in the context of not making it possible for an immigrant worker to leave a specific employee without being deported back to her or his original country. And I found it striking because that's exactly the language that was used in a decision by Israel's High Court of Justice in exactly such a case. Because obviously, as you said, if that is the framework, it means that the employees will be subject to all forms of harassment, ill treatment, and so on, and will have no recourse because they will understand that the employer can fire them, and the repercussions would be that they would lose their ability to continue working in Israel. This sounds perhaps like a story with a happy ending, because obviously if the judges have used that kind of language in Israel's High Court, then they've decided that that kind of measure cannot stand and should be revoked. Unfortunately, there is no happy ending, because it's actually one of the unfortunate examples of cases in which, while there is a pending decision by Israel's High Court, the government has not followed suit and has not changed the procedures that will ban this practice from Israel.
There's really a simple solution to the whole Latino immigrant problem in America. It's one that's improbable, it won't happen, but that would be for Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, and other countries where these people are coming from to tell all Latinos in the United States, don't work for 3 months, we'll pay your salary. That'll end it. The hotel we stayed in last night, the bed probably wouldn't get made up. The roofs wouldn't get put on buildings. The chicken sandwich at McDonald's would cost you about $40 because nobody's going to pick the chickens. I mean, that would bring America to its knees in 2 minutes to realize how very valuable these people are to this country. That's not going to happen, but that would be my solution to it, just a sit-down strike for about 90 days.
That's also lack of facts.
I keep hearing similarities to my own past. It's quite striking. because in South Africa, one of the core structures of the apartheid law was to tie people to employment. And if you had a job, if you're a black person who had a job, you were allowed to be in the cities, but you could only work for the person for whom you had a contract. And if you lost your job, you had to then go back to a homeland and stand in a queue, and you might never get another job. And so it's you see the same sort of thing and the same terrible employment practices which come from it. And it seems as if everything we hear has its replication somewhere else.
My name is Ramon Mullerat. I come from Spain. And I have a general question. I hope not to be too provocative question, but general question. All the members of the panel, all the awardees, have confirmed what we already knew, that they are champions in the defense and the promotion of human rights and fighters against injustices in their own countries and their own environments. But this fight for justice is under law. And talking internationally, globally, this legal order of today is a legal order internationally which permits that half the population of the world is in poverty, and 1/3 of the population lives with less than $1 per capita. A legal order which permits a lot of suffering and wars and bombing and torture and ignorance. I read the other day that every 4 seconds a child dies for lack of food, in hunger. So should we looking for a justice under this law, or should we aim to changing the law? Because even in the traditional democracies of the West, we are happy with laws which we believe to be just, but they are laws which protect our own interest. But laws which permit through trade, through abusive protection of intellectual property, through trade, through investment, that a lot of countries are suffering and are condemned to, I would not say perpetual, but for a long time, poverty, ignorance, and suffering. So we must look for justice. I agree with that, but under a different law, because the law that we have today in the world is not the law I would like to be, the justice to be under. Thank you.
Well,
That's a subject for possibly a weeks-long conference. But let's just hear some views. I mean, the issues you're raising stem from unjust laws in themselves, national laws, through to international relations and trade relations and the concepts of distributive justice. There's a huge amount of discussion. But I'm sure each one of our panelists in their own countries and in their own experience can say something about the law and justice and the disparity between law and justice and ways of addressing it. Let's start and just work down the carrier. We'll start there and we'll move right the way along. If you choose not to speak, just say pass.
All right, okay. It's very important. I mean, for example, in our part of the world, and there is the law, domestic laws, when you look at them, when you look at the constitutions, actually they are providing theoretically equal rights for all. But in practice, there's two policies is there. One is the policy of the states. The other one is policy of the governments. The policy of the government is very pragmatic, but policy of the states directly relate to the fundamental issues. I mean, for example, we mentioned the migrants, internally displaced people, millions of them. We are talking about it. When you talk about these things, you talk about the economical rights, family rights, right to distribution of food, and so on. So the problem we're facing is the domestic legislations might be quite good, but in practice it's not working there. So therefore we argue the international human rights law is a living instrument and can be developed all the time. I mean, for example, issues of the death penalty, issues of the IDPs. And when you look at that, just in practice, you can see that actually your cases can assist the government or push the government, put the government under the obligations to change their laws. And important thing is for the international institutions on that area to work together, and their work could establish a precedent. When we establish precedents, sometimes easy to further develop and to push governments to honor their own obligation, because the main thing is they don't honor their own obligations.
Right.
I believe that we live in a global social order that is unjust, but that does not mean that the bills, the laws are unjust. The problem is how the system as a whole works. For instance, for talking something very popular here in these days, it's not written in a law that government must come to the rescue of banks and be indifferent to the loss of jobs. This is not written in a law. This is a social practice. This is a relation of forces. But as my colleague has said, the international conventions, the international treaties are as a sort of higher constitution that we can resort to force the governments, if there is a social mobilization of enough strong, to apply the laws in a sense more akin to the origin of each law. We are in this beautiful place under the inspiration of the founding fathers of this nation. The law is not unjust. The social system we are living in is unjust.
I very much appreciate the question. Interestingly, the people most skeptical with regard to the effectiveness of using legal mechanisms in order to achieve justice within ACRI are our attorneys. They're the ones most, knowledgeable, experienced, and hesitant with regard to what actually can be achieved through such mechanisms. And yet, we work with what we have, and we try to achieve the most that is possible in the most effective and lasting way. Interestingly, this tension between what is legal and what is just, which may seem to be, in some instances, a complex tension, becomes simpler as legal mechanisms are used in order to make reality more unjust. Sadly, those were parts of the aspects of the process that is happening in Israel that I've described in my comments earlier. And that suddenly pushes more and more people to a point where it's not just the inability to achieve justice through the existing legal system, but also the fact that certain laws that are passed are clearly unjust. And then people resort back to their own morals or to international standards and say what I think is the obvious statement that should be made. This is an unjust law, and the just thing to do would be not to obey it, not to follow it, and hopefully that will also help move forward, some positive change, looking forward. So it's an unfortunate circumstances to be drawn to, but at the same time, those circumstances open to us other mechanisms for social change that do not go through structured legal paths, but more activist ways for achieving change.
Well, I'm not so sure during the history of the entire world as we know it, recorded history, there's been a government that provided for each according to their needs. And I'm not sure that a government can really do that. I think what it requires is a changing of the hearts and minds of the people in the world who run our governments, not the government itself. I've often heard that a country that has the most laws has the least justice. In our own state of Alabama in the United States, our codes, you could stack them up from here to the wall over there, and they're making a new law every day about something. And I don't think that promotes really human and economic justice. We're dealing in the world with a class issue, those that have and those that don't have. And I think that all the religions of the world basically have the philosophy of do unto others. And those who are non-theistic in their beliefs, I think, have that same basic concept. And it's going to take a serious changing of the hearts and minds of people. I think most of us up here do the work we do because we have a deep, abiding moral commitment to fairness and justice. And I'm not so sure that we have any fewer statespeople in our country than we've ever had. I just watched Ken Burns' 3-part program on prohibition, and there were no statespeople around when it was passed, and there were few when it was put back in. So, I mean, it was appalling to me to see how political the people who were against drinking, probably that's something you wouldn't think about. In your country, your wine is very good, and I think that it's nothing new to not have statespeople willing to step up and take a stand. And we've got to, I think, change people's hearts and minds to make this thing work in the long run. The population of the United States, of the world, is increasing exponentially, and we've got to make sure that we can produce the food. When a person is hungry, they're not concerned about the laws, they're concerned about getting bread. And that's another issue, as you say. You could have a symposium on this whole issue. There are people working hard to produce more food and fiber and meats and poultry and other things. And I think that's going to go a long way to alleviating some of the problems.
Yes. Couple things. There would be no Civil Rights Act of 1964 if there had not been some statesmen. There certainly would not have been a Civil Rights Voting Rights Act of 1965. When Lyndon Johnson signed that law, he literally said to everybody, his counselors and advisors, that as I sign this law, the Democrats give the South to the Republican Party. He knew the consequences of what would happen when he signed the Voting Rights Act, but he signed it anyway. He didn't say, because I believe in democratic domination, I'm going to not sign it. There are the 2006, the Voting Rights Act extension, the reauthorization, happened because a senator who was a Republican senator had made a commitment that he would always support voting rights. And he went out into his own party and garnered the votes to pass that law again. Statesmen are important. You can't overestimate their importance. That partisanship will always be there. I don't disagree. But you need people who can stand in the middle and hold the middle, and people who can stand and hold the interest. And that's part of the democracy also. Because otherwise, you don't have a democracy. So you always have, and our worst moments is when we forget those principles. I think that the reason why I love the law, why I like working in the law, why under law means something to me, is because I do believe that it's important to view the law as an organic instrument, that it is something that's organic, that is critical to a society. And the law is never finished. There's no such thing as a final law because circumstances change around laws. So you have to amend them, you have to extend them, you have to revise them. You have to even reconceptualize law. I mean, a good example is that post-Katrina, the first thing that really shocked the Lawyers Committee post-Katrina, after we saw those, just all those thousands and thousands of people, at the Superdome, and after 250,000 families lost their homes in Mississippi and New Orleans, and Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, parts of Texas. The thing that shocked us was that all of a sudden we started seeing ad after ad after ad after ad after ad on the internet, on Craigslist, on all these various lists, saying things like, no blacks need apply. Happy to rent a home, but not to blacks. Happy to rent a home, no Latinos allowed. And we said, oh my God, we haven't seen this since before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and certainly not since 68, the Fair Housing Act. What has happened? What has happened was the internet. And there was no regulation, no direct, when 68 happened, and even when the law was amended later on in 88, no one saw the internet for the Fair Housing Act. So it had nothing about internet-related sorts of medium. The Communications Act that does govern the internet didn't think about discrimination because it didn't see these kinds of robust interchanges of these kinds of listservs and other kinds of networks. So there's a gap. And in that gap has to stand our organizations. We have to become the fashioners of what is the appropriate answer there. I totally agree with everyone that, and I'll stop here, but I totally agree that when I went to law school at Duke, every day I would walk through the main door, and I would shake my head. And because our motto, the motto of the school, talked about the law, but it said not a word about justice. And I would shake my head because I would say, justice is the key. And Morris is totally right that without the spirit of the law, without people's understanding in our society about why the law is there, what it's trying to accomplish, what its goals, what it means to say we the people, who is that we? Without understanding how justice for all means more than just justice for some or justice who can make it to the courts, without that spirit of the law, then our democracy is in danger. So I also appreciate your question.
Thank you. I see a plethora of hands, but I'm afraid we've reached the end of our time. And I may say, Raymond, that we have a good subject for perhaps the first post-Gruber Prize event at Yale Law School, because everybody now wants to speak, and I'm afraid there isn't time for it. I would just like to end this session by saying how much I appreciate everything that all of you have said, how much I appreciate the extraordinary work that you are all doing. And, challenging unjust laws, challenging unjust practices